Hey everybody, this is Julie Quinn, and I'd like to do a quick video that discusses Bring Back the Illustrated Book. This is a really interesting article written by Sam Sachs for The New Yorker, which is a literary magazine, generally speaking. You can tell fiction and poetry, books and culture. There's discussion about the news as well, but this is mostly a literary magazine for like a post-collegiate audience. And this article is called Bring Back the Illustrated Book. I know for freshman readers, this may be a little bit heavy in its language and its terminology. We can tell that Sachs is writing for an academic post-college audience by looking at some of his phraseology. But there's a lot to be said about reading an article like this in an English 111 class. And the reason I make this grand statement is that I feel that Sachs' writing has stretched academic essays into non-academic spaces, like literary magazines here that are, he's not writing this for academic credit, but I feel this is a pretty effective article. You can see in its multi-paragraph approach through this, although it's not a crazy long article, it's probably, if you formatted it, 5 or 6 pages, maybe, right? But it's got that multi-paragraph essay setup. It's got a thesis, and the body paragraphs that build and support thesis. You can tell that Sachs has some educational background in the academy, and let me show you what that looks like. So in the introduction, if you remember, introductions to, and this is an academic argument, by the way, introductions to argumentative essays start with a little bit of background information, maybe a hook detail, and then shift into thesis, usually right before you end the introductory paragraph. If you see what he says, it's curious how much of literature we are conditioned to consider unliterary. Few would contest the canonization of Bleak House, Vanity Fair, The Adventures of Huck Finn, and Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. But these classics have something in common we may be prone to disregard. Each was published with profuse illustrations. In each case, the author relied on their work not only to enhance the aesthetic appeal of the book, but to add meaningfully to the story. So we've got a little bit of background. He's talking about literature. We know it. He's talking about books in the title. And he names some extremely common Western texts of, we would say, maybe late 19th and early to mid 20th century, right? And mostly, 19th century texts here. Vanity Fair, Bleak House, Adventures of Huck Finn, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. These are considered quote-unquote classics, right? But he presents an argument. These texts were published with illustrations, so they had drawings in the margins, right? And in each case, the author relied on the artwork. So that's an opinion that the author needed this artwork to do two things. So it's an argument with a plan of development of two reasons. One, to enhance the beauty, the aesthetic appeal of the book, but two, to add meaning above and beyond what was presented with the words, right? So he's got a two-part argument. Let's see if he can back it up. And what I like about this is that you can see even body paragraphing with topic, sentence, data, and discussion. The discussion can range, and the examples are presented not in a way that an academic writer would with in-text citation, but you don't actually need that when you're writing professionally. But you can see a really nice topic sentence. Sachs says, some of the art from the golden age of the illustrated novel remains a vital companion to the text. And then he provides examples with Lewis Carroll's rabbit hole. If you right click, he hyperlinks to these very specific images to draw the reader in with specifics. So he doesn't have to have a quote because he's talking about imagery, but he presents the images. And since this is a professional text, the images aren't all buried. We've got this one of Alice buried into the text, but he can hyperlink to others. Consider that a way of referencing, right? Professionally versus academically. So he talks about that he describes them, Alice eerily elongated after eating the currant cake, and then George Cruikshank was a brilliant artist, that these emotive drawings of Oliver Twist, of characters in the text. He says, have a tenacious hold on the imagination. So we've got some opinion here, but it's mostly data driven. Here are the images, and here's proof that they existed in these famous texts. But then he provides an interesting discussion, and he does sometimes through rhetorical questioning, or through some modern examples. He says, but we almost never find them in contemporary novels, and on the rare occasions they appear there, it's ironic anachronism. So it's ironically out of time. You know, anachronism is like watching Ben-Hur and seeing one of the gladiators wearing a watch, right? Because that actually didn't happen. But in Susanna Clarke's Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, or Umberto Eco's Prague Cemetery, these are texts where the action and the characters live in 19th century genre fiction. And so even though they're modern texts, they're written about that time when these images were popular. And so he says, even as graphic novels enjoy a surge of newfound critical appreciation, the common consensus seems to be the pictures don't belong anymore. Well, why not? So he asks some rhetorical questions, and it propels forward. We know he's talking about the artwork having an aesthetic appeal. He starts that discussion right here with some very specific examples. And then he moves on to talk now about adding meaning to the story through different examples of famous writers and the art. Like Thackeray was one of the examples he provides here when he talks about the book Vanity Fair. So in this paragraph, he says, in the book, we have this character, Becky Sharp. And what's not explicitly stated in the text is stated in the images, where he draws her. Thackeray was both an artist and the writer. Sometimes they're two different people. Like Dickens worked with H.K. Brown. Right? Brown was the artist, Dickens was the writer. But Thackeray designed these images himself, obviously, and he depicted the characters: a man-eating mermaid, a female Napoleon, and a husband slayer, right? And so this adds meaning because he never explicitly said that she committed a murder, but he hints to it in the image. So that's how the images aren't just appealing to draw out emotion, but they give you additional information. So what we can get from reading a writer like Sachs is we can see the multi-paragraph essay. We can see a thesis. We can see it defended in body paragraphs. But we also see a movement away from that very sort of artificial, all right, you have a thesis with 3 points, and so you have 1 to 2 pages in each of those points. What's interesting is that he presents the points, and then what ends up happening is that he explains how these images stopped being used in fiction from the late 19th and early century. And he says it has to do with Henry James, and it has to do with Virginia Woolf and their concerns of cinema, and how film in its artistic form will take the place of, especially Henry James, I think, was worried about this, that it will take the place of the work of the writer. And Virginia Woolf complained that with Anna Karenina, with that text, that we don't get to hear internal monologue anymore. We just get to sort of see how pretty she is, but we don't get to really, unless somebody's doing a talk over, you don't get to actually hear what's going on in a brain. So you really only see action. You don't get to hear thoughts and ideas are really big in texts, right? And novels. And so we then get to the discussion of a shift. And what happens toward the end of this is that Sachs talks about Michael Chabon, the Pulitzer Prize winning author, and his text Telegraph Avenue, where he's got this Mr. Nostalgia character, 44, walrus mustache, grainy glasses. He's wearing a Hawaiian t-shirt or Hawaiian shirt, and he's at like a Comic-Con. And he's saying this description is so powerful that wouldn't it be great if we got some illustrations again? And if you recall at the beginning of this, he's very academic with these classics have something in common we tend to not pay attention to. Each had these illustrations, and the illustrations added beauty and meaning. That's how he said it at the beginning, and I'm paraphrasing. And if you look at the end, with his conclusion, he mirrors it back. He says, what's the use of a book without pictures? And he recalls Lewis Carroll and Alice again. And now he brings in some more modern texts that adults of my generation probably remember, like Charlotte's Web or The Phantom Tollbooth. And he says, well, Lewis Carroll's Alice may have a point. Writers may demur, reasonably concluding that they are accountable for just the text. And I'm paraphrasing again. But he says this: the interplay between art and text is rich with possibilities that few fiction writers have even begun to explore. Illustrations are fun. Giving up on them sacrifices real pleasure for a needlessly narrow conception of literary purity, which is what, James was talking about, and Virginia Woolf to a certain extent. This is a restatement of thesis in a really fresh way. And academic writers and English 111 can learn so much from a text like this. How do you frame out an argument? How do you use purposeful repetition? How do you write body paragraphs? How do you use specific data to support it? And so on. So this is the reason I wanted you to read, bring back the illustrated book. I hope that you built some vocabulary with words like pastiche and or some of the other ones that he used here, which I thought was just really interesting. Profuse, which just means a lot. He used where is this? There's a couple of urban tableau. He even talked about William Hogarth, and when we generally talk about this in the class, I'll bring up Gin Lane and show the exaggerations of art in the 19th. Starting really in the 18th century, but 18th and 19th century art that was more political commentary and how that sort of fed its way into these texts. But you can see that you can build your own sort of academic vocabulary by reading texts that are sometimes a little bit uncomfortable to read when they are as advanced with like terms like motif and pastiche and frontispiece and so on and so forth. So my hope is that as you read this, you also were sort of, looking up some of these words. Now you get the opportunity to use them. Once you use them, you really do add them fully to your vocabulary. So you can hopefully see the shape of an academic essay, effective paragraphing, good thesis writing, thoughtful detailing, and vocabulary building. If you have any questions on this article and how it applies to the work you're doing in the class, just reach out and let me know.